Hi, so in this week's community forum, I'd like to talk about a post that's been ticking along quite nicely on the MMO Champion forums, and that is which role makes the best raid leader? So what we're going to do is we're going to go over the four main roles within a raid and then discuss what some people are saying are the pros and cons. I'll add in my own commentary as well as to which makes an ideal raid leader. The four roles we're going to be talking about, of course, are tanks, melee DPS and range DPS, because there is a difference between the two, especially on this topic, and finally healers. What we won't do, though, is what some people have done on forums, I suppose inevitably, is to say that some roles are just really bad for it or some roles are really good for it. You can't say that one role is just totally unsuitable, because you can only be proved wrong by that statement. If you say that one role is unsuitable and then someone else says, well, I raid lead at a really high competitive world ranking in that role, then you've immediately lost, of course. So first up, it's tanks. If we look at the poll here, we can see, tanks are way out in front. If you've been, I've been in a number of raid guilds over the years, going back to 2005, and a lot of the raid leaders that I've had have been tanks. It's a very common role. Does that make it the most suitable? Maybe, maybe not. Now, before we go into any detail here, I want to talk about cause and effect. I'm going to go into a little bit of a science lesson. Sorry about this. Just because you have a correlation doesn't necessarily mean that the two things are linked. There's actually quite a good website I use with my students when we try to teach this that shows all sorts of mad things with a very high correlation, but they're not linked at all. But the example I always give is to say, ice cream causes sunburn, to which people will go, no. But I can say, but when sales of ice cream go up, incidence of sunburn goes up. And people know that that's nonsense because they know that the ice cream goes up, when it's hot and it's summer, and of course that's when you're more likely to get sunburn as well. But they know the two things are not linked. But sometimes when you show someone two things that are linked and they don't know the explanation, they think that that's a causal effect. So a lot of tanks are raid leaders. Now, there are benefits, and some of the benefits that people have come up with are as follows. One, some people have said, well, tanking's not the most involved job, and it gives them lots of time to check on how other people are doing. I think this was definitely true during vanilla. I still think there were differences between good and bad tanks in vanilla, but the actual role of tanking was certainly not involved. I think it is more so now, to be fair. I actually give tanks a lot of credit these days. There is a lot more to do. There was a time in the first two or three expansions, in fact, where I was perfectly comfortable tanking. If someone just said, "Oh, you need to," I tanked multiple bosses in Sunwell, for example, or off-tanked, and I'm fine with that. I've even main tanked a few things in those first three expansions. It was fine. I don't like doing it now. I'm not good at it now. It's the sort of thing I think I'd have to do it a few times regularly to be any good at it. But there are a number of tanks who still say that they are perfectly comfortable tanking and raid leading. The counter to this, which is also valid, I think, is that with a lot of bosses, you've got a big-ass boss right in your face. You might be jammed up against a wall as well. Your view is quite limited. You might be able to see timers and call timers out, but is that raid leading? Not really. People can have their own timers. It's useful to call out really important things, but is that raid leading? No, that's not the extent of it. You need to know what other people are doing. You need to know when some shit's happened so that you can come up with another instruction to try and deal with the situation, rather than have everyone individually try and deal with it in their own way. Is that easy when you're staring basically at the bollocks of a huge boss towering over you? It's not that easy. It's not that easy. So then we come back to, so these are two counter views. Why are there so many tanks raid leading? Surely that means that they're really good for it. There is another explanation that I've often thought about, And that is, if you think about the experience of people playing World of Warcraft for the first time, and you level up. I mean, when you're solo and you're soloing, whatever. But then you go into dungeons. That's your first experience of group content in all likelihood. Could be Battlegrounds, I suppose. But they came after I was level 60, so I don't associate it with that. But I think for most people it would be dungeons regardless, even though you can go into Battlegrounds earlier. And you see the tank as the leader because they are the ones who have to move forward. You know how it is in a dungeon. If the tank doesn't really know what they're doing or where to go, it's a slow process. If they do, it's very quick. So I think the role of tank appeals to a lot of people who see themselves as leaders. Now, some of those people do have good leadership qualities. Some of them have piss poor leadership qualities. They just think they're good leaders. A bit like the manager in The Office, the Ricky Gervais character. I just think I think there's an element of that. So although it's valid to say that, you know, some tanks feel that once, you know, they've got a handle on the fight, they're perfectly at liberty to see what everyone else is doing. I just think that the reason there are so many tanks is because this association with people who see themselves as leaders see that in the tanking role. And so I think it's a self-fulfilling prophecy almost. But that's my opinion. Next up is Mele DPS. Now, this is the complete opposite. I haven't really seen too many comments saying that Mele DPS as a role make for good raid leaders. But again, we can't say that you can't be a good raid leader as Mele, because inevitably there are people actually doing it. I've not come across too many myself. In fact, I think the only Mele raid leader I can really think of... Oh no, there may be a couple. There was myself mainly, but I used to raid lead quite a bit in Vanilla and TBC. And I actually stopped in TBC. I haven't raid led any progress fights since TBC. And what stopped me was changing from Holy Paladin to Retribution. I felt that I was not able to properly see what was going on as Mele. The opposite problem, well, the same problem as a tank, I suppose, in much way, only I've got my back to the raid. At least a tank is facing the raid, usually. But I don't see too many people saying that Mele DPS would make the best raid leaders. And I think the reasons are, one, your view is so severely limited. You've got your whole back to the raid. Most of the raid is missing. All the ranged and healers are usually at your sight on most fights. Even if you've got your camera zoomed out, as I do, but not everyone does. You've got a lot of shit going on around you. There's a lot of graphics in Mele, and you've got to be able to move out of things really quickly. There's a lot going on. I'm not saying it's the most difficult role, of course, but there is a lot going on that can easily distract you at a time where a raid leader needs to be calling shit out. I mean, that one's the most cut and dried, I think. Ranged DPS, on the other hand, seem quite suitable because they have a lot of flexibility with positioning. Now, this is really good because it means you can position yourself so that you can see the whole raid. I very much identify that. As a teacher, I am used to considering where I stand in a class when I'm delivering content, when I'm doing my lesson, or when I'm just monitoring students getting on with the tasks I've set them. And you learn as a teacher, when you're a teacher trainer, you learn to consider the layout of the room and what are the best places to, one, be able to see everyone, or two, make sure that if you have to have your back turned, it's to the students who will be able to get on and not be stupid when your back's turned. So you consider your position very carefully. The same is true of ranged DPS raid leaders, of course. They can consider where to place themselves because very few fights require them to stand on a sixpence. There are a few, like Hans and Franz, for example, in Blackrock Foundry was one. So which generally means you can have whatever view you like. And a lot of people, again, very positive about that. If we look at this, there's a fairly significant bar for DPS. I think that's just because the person who came up with the poll didn't really split it up between melee and ranged DPS. I suspect if they had, and certainly if you read through the comments in this post, you would find that overwhelmingly the people saying yes for DPS are people who are talking about ranged DPS. Finally, we have healers. Now, healer is the role that I had when I have certainly when I raid led in vanilla and TBC, which is the only time I've raid led progress content. A lot of the arguments are in favour of healers in that you are naturally aware of where people are in your healing role. You're aware of where they are, you're aware of what they're doing, you're aware of the people who take too much damage, you're aware of the people who are pretty good, not taking lots of damage, you're aware of the timings of the fight because you may well have to coordinate defensive cooldowns amongst the healers. You're aware of so many things, you're aware of what's going on with the tanks in a way that DPS are not going to be. You're aware of lots of aspects of the fight, and you have the benefit of ranged DPS in that you have a lot of flexibility over where you plant your feet. So, all in all, there's a lot of good things to be said about healers. The only counter at the moment you could argue is there's a bit of a pattern in a lot of guilds, certainly I've experienced, where you have a raid leader, and they might be a tank, they might be a DPS, say, and then you have a separate healing officer who takes care of the healing duties, and that perhaps that's a good system. Some people argue that this is a good system. So what you effectively have are two raid leaders. You have your main raid leader, and then you have the healing raid leader who specifically deals with that aspect of it, and that sort of teamwork is better than a single person doing all the raid leading. My own personal view is I do think healers make the best raid leaders. My own experience has sort of led me to this, as well as just the fact I can't really think of anything against it myself, because it is true, you are naturally aware of what everyone else is doing. You are aware of where everyone is if you're a good healer, and so I would, if you ask my opinion, I would say in order that healers do make the best raid leaders, I would say then it's ranged DPS, then it is probably tanks, because tanks, as much as they've got a pair of boss's testicles in their face, they're at least pointing the right way. And then melee DPS in last place. But I will caution it again, just as I did at the start, by saying that, of course, none of the roles prevent you being a good raid leader, and that there are effective raid leaders in all of these roles that compete in world ranks as well. So, yeah. But what do you think? What do you think are some reasons that maybe other people haven't said? The post is still up there now. You could go and add your own comments to it as well. And in the meantime, don't forget to like, comment and subscribe. And until next week when we do another one of these, I'll see you later.